wanted to bring in a special guest, and I actually met Lindsay through kind of my burnout network, and we were just talking about trauma and how we get here. And you certainly know my story about burnout and how it got to a traumatic stress that my brain has completely blocked out memories. I have memory loss of very special times, but also very chaotic times. I have trigger responses that I've been talking about in my vlog. And then we were talking also what happens in the workforce when we keep people in chronic stress and the behaviors that start to go into almost a trauma response behavior. So I brought in a trauma therapist, Lindsay, and she has an amazing story. And we all know the best practitioners, the best specialists have been there. All right. They didn't just go to it to have an education in it. There's a pure purpose behind where they went. So welcome, Lindsay. Let me dig into right away. What's your story? How did you get here being a trauma therapist?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kelly. Um, Such a loaded question, right? And I will just start by saying, yeah, I was the one on the couch. When you think about therapy, I was the one on the couch for a long time. There's been different moments in my life. I kind of refer to them as like redefining moments that kind of led me to where I am today. I think one of the biggest ones from a mental health standpoint, I went through alcoholism to the point where I almost died from grand mal seizures, and I know so much now from being in recovery for many years that so much of that was fueled on anxiety and this like imposter syndrome and just not really feeling good enough. And I coped in that way. I was in a really unhealthy relationship at that time as well that did not support my recovery. So I had to make the difficult decision of leaving that relationship. Um, so renewing myself through the recovery of alcoholism was that first really big redefining moment for me. I didn't know what I wanted to do as I got older, as an adult, right? At that time. And my recovery journey led me into realizing I wanted to do something in the mental health field because that was such a needed area for me in order to even survive, let alone thrive in how I wanted to live. Um, Went to school, got my education. The first job that I had outside of college as a therapist is where I experienced burnout for the first time. It was
Wait,
an,
let's stop right there. So
yeah,
you're telling me that you're going to school for a therapist, you're going to be working as a therapist, and even you got burnout. Let's just point that out.
totally, totally. It happens to anybody. It does not discriminate. And we can get maybe a little bit more into this when we get into the meat of our talk, but you talk about like societal norms and pressures in the mental health field, there's a very big push of burnout treatment is just more self-care. Just do more self-care. And the onus is very much placed on the person. There's a time and a place for that. We all have to do things to grow and change. But when society puts that on, or the workplace puts that solely on the person, there's a problem there. There's a societal systemic system error there. So yeah, as a therapist too, totally burned out. And I noticed my one moment in particular sticks out to me where I was, left my job. I was driving to daycare to pick up my kids, and I had no music on. I was a zombie just driving. No passion. I was not even excited to see my kids. It was just there was no enjoyment there. And that was a huge reality check. So that was another huge redefining moment for me. I'm not living this way anymore. I got to start setting more boundaries, all of that kind of thing. The last big piece of what led me here today is I did change jobs. I started working at a trauma residential facility. At that time, I'm not sure about now, but it was the only one in the United States. So it was an incredible
Wow.
training opportunity. Um, and I had an amazing supervisor, which was so healing from what I came from, and learned a lot, realized through working with people with trauma and PTSD, how certain pieces of that diagnosis shows up for everybody. We all have some form of trauma. We might not have a PTSD diagnosis, but we have some form of trauma. And that's what kind of inspired me to help women, especially, heal, elevate, and succeed in the home and the workplace because there are these societal pressures, internal pressures, trauma that just keeps us stuck. And it's so incredible to see women uplifting themselves.
Yeah. Wow. So there was a couple things that you said that resonated with what we've been discussing out here on the channel and the listeners out of my podcast. Is one, you were talking about the leadership switch, and I highlight that, and I think sometimes as an outside consultant, people blow that off. But the number one reason why people leave is their boss. Some trauma
Absolutely.
related behaviors that come out later is because of people's bosses, and so your leadership style and what you're doing to grow in that area to lead your team through change matters. You were in a
Hugely.
very chaotic environment, and then you were in another chaotic environment, but the leader led it well.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah.
They
And
made
it
all the difference.
they made yes. And so it's interesting that you talk about these little nuggets that go into the workplace. As a therapist and the behaviors that are coming up. So let's dig into this societal pressures a little bit more because especially with your story of alcoholism, we live in the Midwest. Both me and Lindsay live in the Midwest. And so it's very common to party it up. Every gathering you go to, a plethora of not just food, but alcohol. There's just as many bars as there is churches, that whole saying. And it's taboo when you don't drink. People think you're sick. People think, why are you here? And I really ran into that during my burnout collapse because I couldn't drink. Not just because of my whole entire health, but like my gut could not react to the liquor and alcohol. And it was interesting how many people just didn't want me around. Some people asked me if I was depressed because I wasn't drinking. So I would walk around with like a water seltzer or something to feel inclusive. But this is the societal pressures when you go on this growth journey, when you go into this therapeutic state where you want to heal, right? There's a want there, a will, and you want to do the things. How how do societal pressures kind of cause the trauma response to stay or kind of hold you back from recovering?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And this is why I enjoy talking about this topic so much because I do feel like we're getting better as a society. You kind of hear people talk about trauma a little bit more. But like what does that really mean? And again, I think there is a difference between PTSD, the diagnosis, post-traumatic stress disorder, and a trauma response. So when, to answer your question, when we go through childhood experiences, with like, primary parental figures, we go through these different environments. Those people in those environments do shape us. They shape our belief systems about ourselves, other people, and the world. So if there is a negative or painful experience or message that is being communicated to you directly or even indirectly through just, an example would be like a parent who's just kind of cold, maybe not very emotionally available. That person might learn, oh, when I'm emotional, it's not safe or my needs
Mm,
aren't being met. So it may not be directly said, but these
yeah.
messages are being portrayed to us. That is a trauma belief, a trauma response. And like I said, it shapes the way we view ourselves, other people in the world. So they can be kind of subtle sometimes. It might be, if you really look at it, you can see, oh, that might be connected to this experience that I went through. So that awareness around these behaviors and like what are the barriers to my growth is so important because it can be rooted in trauma.
Yeah. And that's a huge factor just in, like you said, how you perceive the world. Because when you look at people around you, close or otherwise, like work, coworkers, peers, there's people that suck and there's people that you just like you get along with. And a lot of it stems from what you're saying is these subtle hints. Like there's someone that I could express emotions to, or that I'm overwhelmed, or I could go to my boss, like it's a very healthy culture, but I have been groomed or have had previous responses from others to say not to speak up. And that, when you said that, I just actually clicked, and this is in my burnout book, that I let it get to my burnout collapse before my boss knew. And I mean, I was 103 pounds. I was covering it all up. And as a woman in a male dominant field, that's just kind of what you do. And I didn't realize that's what you do until things got really bad and I had to leave the workforce. And my boss is like, how the hell did this happen? We talk every day. And I realized like that was my response is you always just kind of push through. You always just keep going, which I guess brings me to my next question. Let's dig into this a little further because this is huge. I think this is huge why people have a hard time growing or stepping into this recovery is can you highlight some of these like gender norms and classes, the influence that this is having on us from getting us to where we want to go? Because we see it, right? We want it, but it seems unobtainable at times.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so if we look at like gender norms in particular, so if we're looking at, you know, like a female, for example, there's messages that society, social media, generational patterns, again, messages that are being sometimes direct but indirect on how we should be. And some of those would be, like this need to be perfect, this perfect what, employee, this perfect mother. And that could be, if I'm not perfect, then I either will not get or don't deserve love and appreciation. So again, tying this to these belief systems that we have, it could be, like with my example of like growing up in an environment where being vulnerable is not something that's valued or even it's punished. Well, you're going to be kind of cold. If we think about that as you grow up now, how does that influence your relationships with your kids if you're cold, with your employees if you're cold? All of this works as a system. It's not just one person that's the problem, because again, everybody has these types of belief systems. So, awareness for everybody, that emotional intelligence to be able to, one, be aware of it, but then also, what am I going to do about it? And do I understand how this is influencing and affecting other people around me? So tying that to like a trauma response too with gender norms, maybe you find yourself being a little bit more hyper vigilant. You're looking around and scanning the environment and the people to
Mm.
see, is there a threat? How are people feeling today? Because I don't want to be in an uncomfortable, unsafe environment. Stress level is higher now. So now we're talking about chronic stress, right? Leading to burnout, all of those types of things. I think there's also dual expectations. I hear this a lot from especially women, but this expectation that I have to excel in the workforce like I'm a full-time employee and
Mm.
excel as a parent or a mother and the household, all that that entails, as if I'm a full-time stay-at-home parent.
I knew exactly where this was going. Yep.
It is just unrealistic, right? And I do think that there are disproportionately more women versus men who carry more mental load. It's not just the executing of tasks. I have to do this task. It's also the mental load is also continually thinking about, do I have all of this stuff done and am I forgetting something too? So again, that's also just set up because of the way society is set up.
I was when we talk about flexible work schedules and fractional workers, offering more part-time roles and things like that. I mean, Lindsay's hitting this on the head, is that it's solving a problem while still successfully supporting working families. You're still getting great talent. Um, but when you don't offer those, you're forcing talent to choose. And when you look at a bigger picture, and I guess it's probably for a different episode, but you look at what's going on with children and the problems we're having in schools, it's because of lack of parenting. But yet we want a successful workforce and we want everyone in the workforce. So you can't have both, but there
Yeah,
is a different solution for integration.
yeah,
And I think it's always been this binary bias of you have to be a great worker or you have to be at home, or vice versa. If you're too much at work, you're a bad parent. If you're too much um, at home and not at work, you're not a team player. And that's what you're kind of saying, is that influence of societal norms and those little subtle hints and sayings that people say that eat away at you. And I love that you said that. Like, it's so subtle that we don't recognize it until you're looking in the mirror and you don't like what you see.
yep, yep, absolutely. And even, on the opposite side of that, because we talked a lot about like, the maybe the mother's experience, but even the father, I've heard so many people, males say, "No, I'm not taking my full parental leave." Because of the societal pressure and the stigma around that. Oh, you're not a team player. What do you mean you're going to take all this time off of work, And again, those things do influence us even sometimes on a very subtle level. And I think you had brought up like, social or like classes too. And I think there's if we look at the big picture and go back in history, this idea of this perfect life, this perfect family, really was created by wealthy white social classes.
Yeah.
And even if you look at like times during slavery, part of the reason why people got to that level is because they had slaves. They had help and support where they could focus on, the parenting, and even then they still had help with slavery too, right?
Yeah.
But that is kind of how society helped shape some of that stuff. We don't have the same support systems anymore. People are more spread out, they're more isolated. Again, now women are in the workforce more than they ever were compared to history. So we have these modern expectations that I should still have the house spotless. I should still be
Hmm.
this excellent parent, and I should still be excelling and succeeding in my career, but with less help and less um not updated societal and career support.
Yeah. And really, like, I remember that shift too, because we had like a country homestead and I was always gardening and I enjoyed gardening, but I didn't realize it wasn't for the look. It wasn't for the landscape picturesque. It was because it was just something I could do that wasn't work, it wasn't kids, it was just like a zoned out physical thing that I could see a beginning and an end. Uh, what I didn't realize is I missed that sweet spot. I kept going for the viewership. And it's interesting because like we live in the middle of nowhere. We don't really have visitors, but when they did, my yard was immaculate. It was beautiful. And but at what cost?
Yeah.
Because I had full-time job, three kids, and I was burning myself out by this perfection. I read this great book, and I don't even know the title because a lot of books have mentioned this, that our yards were never meant to be these landscape beautiful things. They were meant to grow your food. or feed your animals food that you are now eating those animals. And the only people that had nice yards were the wealthy. And they
Mhm.
had exactly what you said, help to maintain the yards. But now we also do that. We maintain our
Yep.
yards. We work. We do it home. And so we've up, even though the world has gotten more simplistic and convenient, right? You don't even have to go to a store anymore to go shopping. It's right at your door in a day. We
Yep.
have filled we have filled the time with more demands and functions. So I want to go back to a term before we run out of time because it was interesting that you said we've been talking about trauma, but you've mentioned PTSD multiple times. And I never thought of PTSD in this field because I think of post-traumatic stress disorder, like people who have had something so traumatic, like severe abuse, military. I think of all those situations and people we know that they trigger and they you can't get them back. That they're a medication for it just to live in daily operations. That's what I think of, but you keep mentioning it. So is trauma just PTSD, or how does it show up that you're kind of linking this without the PTSD diagnosis?
Yeah. Yeah. So when we're talking about PTSD, you have to have a licensed clinician go through the criteria to see if you meet criteria for that diagnosis, which means, there's changes in like your mood, your cognitive functioning, your essentially it's your nervous system reacting to a perceived threat. Um, and that's where things get a little haywire and you have these kind of classic PTSD symptoms. But as I said, just because you don't meet the criteria for that doesn't mean that you have on some level some of those same pieces. And I think belief systems is a huge one. So no, you might not be having another example would be like flashbacks we think of like with PTSD. You might not be having flashbacks, but you're having these like kind of unwanted thoughts that come up, or they're triggered when you're around certain people or certain
Yeah.
situations, and it does affect your stress levels. So that's kind of more of what trauma is versus a PTSD diagnosis.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate the differentiation of that because uh I think the key kicker there was triggers because we all have rooms that we have been in where stuff has happened or houses or places, even parking lots. There's certain parking lots that I would just like break down or be numb and I go into those and I feel like the reaction's starting, but I'm in a better place now. So like I acknowledge it, I'm aware of it, and then I shut it down in a way that's healthy and processing. But it triggers those moments where I'm like uncontrollably bawling in the parking lot because I'm so overwhelmed and there's three kids screaming in the back and I'm just like I
Yeah.
need to get in and get groceries, those type of things.
Yeah.
So uh, the trigger thing, I think is a great term that you use that we can still have trauma responses.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to differentiate before we go is what would you say? I think that trauma kind of gets thrown around a little bit by um, different type of people where they're like, that was traumatic. And I try not to get offended by that as someone who has went through trauma. But and there's people who that went through way worse things that I'm sure would get offended by that. How can we start to redefine that word so that we can truly help people where it is traumatic, and people that just are going through a stressful time, and which means it's temporary. It's not going to have long-term effects on them. How can we start to approach that conversations with those people without saying, "Don't say that word"? Um,
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting concept because like I get why people do it. They do that with a lot of mental health diagnosis now, I think because of like TikTok and stuff, right?
yeah,
Like it's the pros and cons of social media. Like that person is narcissistic or I have, that's OCD. They do that with a lot of stuff. And I get it because the brain likes to categorize things. That's how our brain works. this is a cow because of X, Y, and Z, right? Like we that's how our brain works. So it's easy just to say, oh, that was a trigger, or, that was traumatic. It's an easy way to communicate what we're saying. So I would encourage people to be more specific about what actual feeling is coming up. So we're describing our experience more specifically. So instead of just saying, like, if somebody, I don't know, called you a name and you're like, oh, that was triggering, that was traumatic. Okay, instead say something like, I feel sad when you say X, Y, and Z. Now we're getting very clear. We're opening the conversation up for boundaries instead of just throwing a label on it.
Yeah.
That's how I would kind of, encourage people to start shifting away, because I think on the receiving end, because so many people do say stuff like that, oh, it's triggering. People are like, "Ugh, okay, great." And they don't even like take you seriously anymore. It's like,
Yeah,
oh, they're
that's
being dramatic and they're just being dramatic about it. But if you're super specific, it's hard to it's hard to argue with somebody's feelings. Their feelings are valid. I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm happy, whatever.
Yeah. I love that you took a deeper dive into this because I think it is so common in the workforce that it's being blown off, but something is still happening. It's just the
Yes.
wrong word. And
Yep.
so let's take that leadership example that you said in the beginning here. You have a leader that says, "Hey, well, let's slow down." But your previous leader that was on your butt, shutting you down, silencing you when you would speak up, said the same thing. Slow it down. You're being dramatic or something like that. Well, your new boss says slow it down, but really they're coming from a place of like helping, like actually breaking it down with you. Like, hey, you might be getting ahead of yourself or you're getting in your head, like being helpful and supportive. Uh, Instead of saying, wow, you are triggering, right? We're now in two different conversations of it's not healthy
Yeah.
conflict. It's this aversion you're creating between the conversation. You're not even speaking the same language. So this is a great time to say, instead of like, hey, you're triggering me, or my boss just triggered me. Hey, okay, do you know, can I talk about my previous boss and some things that happened? One, you're moving from this like cliche conversation of just saying words to moving up to this rapport and building trust, because you're bringing in previous experiences and the beliefs that you're talking about. And the relationship will be different. This is a solution orientated conversation now. You're moving
Yes.
from this conflict and you're going to either avoid it or make it worse to, I think we just had a growth moment together because now he or she now understands me, and I probably just released something off my chest because I communicated with the right words. And I think I love that play on words, because when you can really define it and name it what it is, we can move forward. But
Yes.
if you want to paint it over with absolutes, uh it's going to be stuck, and like you said, it's going to be washed down. No one's going to care to hear it anymore. And
Yes.
from an HR person, why I think I wanted to bring up this question is I would hear people say I'm triggering, and I know people that actually get triggered and they have a response, and we actually are trained to respond to them because it's so medically necessary too. And that's just their day, right? And
Yep.
that's scary to me that that is such on a high medical level of response. And then you have people that were just using the word. I'm like, please don't wash it down, because for them, they need this. They need this to
Yes.
survive. And we need to use the actual words because it's also not aiding you. You're going to be seen as the dramatic, or they always say that. And that's not great for you either because you are missing a need.
Yes.
Let's identify it.
Yeah. That's the example you gave is such a good example. And I think, that's where that emotional intelligence conversation has to come in, because the person who's saying the word triggering in that example has to, one, have the awareness of of what is going on in their body, be able to regulate that to even get to that point of being able to do anything different. But then also that social awareness and management piece of, do I even know how the other person is receiving what I'm doing. And in your solution there, the different, the way that it was responded differently, you're building empathy, you're being vulnerable, you're connecting. And to your point, now we can talk about a solution and moving forward. Yeah,
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah. And I feel like all of us know that leader, that boss too, that their behaviors has always been that way and we accept it. But has anyone actually had a conversation with them? Like a
Right.
real conversation? Most leaders want to do right by their people.
Yeah.
Why would you go through all that extra nonsense if you don't like people? And so having a really good conversation moves into healthy conflict, and healthy conflict is growth, either in yourself, in them, or each other. And it's an amazing moment because then you realize this stuff isn't scary.
Yeah.
When you use the right words, the right words. I love that. I'm gonna be every time I hit conflict, I'm gonna be like, what is the right words to say right now?
Yeah.
Uh, I love that. Well, we're at time, but me and Lindsay have talked about multiple topics within trauma, within her therapy, in how we navigate this modern day world with the societal pressures and continue to move forward in a practical manner. If you have more questions about this, why don't you go ahead and leave them in the comments, and me and Lindsay will hop on another future video and answer those for you. If you're looking for services, please reach out to Lindsay, and her information's in the description. Thanks for your time today, Lindsay. This was so informative, and it has brought so much light to these topics that it seems like we weren't getting the right information. So I really appreciate you shining light.
Absolutely. I loved being here. Thanks for the invite, Kelly.